Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to tonight's session. And in tonight's session, I get to welcome Angharad Welsh, who is one of our speech and language therapists and is the speech and language therapist that has been supporting us within the Facebook group for, I think probably about 2 years now, Angharad. I'm not really sure, but around about that time. So this is a bit of an interesting session. It's ask questions and find out a bit about speech and language and how we can support our students within school. So I'm going to throw a question at you to start with, Angharad, before I even get you to introduce yourself. And it is, what is a speech and language therapist?
Okay, so a speech and language therapist is somebody who specialises in assessing and treating all the skills around communication. So speech specifically is speech sounds and how intelligible you are when you're communicating. Language is your ability to understand and use language in all its forms. So that might be spoken language or alternative forms of communication. Also includes to an extent written language too. And then thinking more broadly about how successful people are in terms of their communication skills. So can they use their language skills to be effective communicators? So that takes us all the way from babies all the way through to adults, everything in between. And some therapists also specialise in feeding and swallowing, which used to be my job. And so yeah, anything with your mouth and your throat and your brain interacting with each other essentially is what we do.
That sounds strange when you put it in that context. But, yeah, okay. So brilliant, thank you. I like that answer. So tell us, how did you get into being a speech and language therapist? What led you down that route?
Okay, so well, when I was little, I had speech therapy myself. So that's sort of how I knew it existed as a profession. And then basically when I was at I wish I had like a really inspirational story about a family member or something, but I don't. When I was at school, I quite liked my sciences, but I basically wanted to do something practical that was also sciencey. And when I went away and researched sort of the therapy jobs for what came up, so I also thought about becoming an OT. And my school was completely horrified that I wanted to be a speech therapist because I went to very academic school, so they wanted me to be a doctor because that looked better on the, on the prospectus and whatever. So I was quite determined. And yeah, basically I wanted to do a practical job that was also quite rooted in science. And so it's just the perfect job for me. It's very pragmatic, problem-solving kind of job, and that suits my temperament.
Fair enough. And what's the route to becoming a speech and language therapist? I'm assuming A-levels and then degree, or?
Yeah, well, there are more routes now than when I started. So when I qualified, which was 20 years ago coming up, it was purely degree. So you had to do A-levels and the degree, or you could apply with other qualifications and they would take you on a case-by-case basis. In the last year, I think it's just the first intake will be happening around September. There's now an apprenticeship route into speech therapy, which is new and a bit untested. So whereby essentially you work in a speech and language therapy assistant role in an existing team, and then you train as you work. So you're earning money the whole time. So I'm hoping that will be a good route into speech therapy for a lot of people. There is one course in the UK that does part-time speech therapy course. So it takes you 7 years to qualify that way.
Yeah, that's a long time.
You have to really want to do it. So there are the two main ways of doing that now. But I would say the apprenticeship is very much still in the being figured out stage. So I think quite a lot of departments are kind of keeping their tinder dry and seeing how it works out for other people.
Fair enough. Okay. And is there a shortage of speech and language therapists across the country? Do you know, or what would you say?
Definitely. There's definitely, the speech and language need is absolutely massive. The difficulty with speech and language therapy is, to an extent, I'm not sure exactly how the funding works now, but when I qualified, there was a bursary to train as a speech therapist because it was an NHS shortage profession. And so as a consequence, the NHS England essentially could put a limit on how many places could be offered on speech therapy courses. So even though there is a shortage, there's also a shortage of how many people you can train every year, because speech therapy placements are a big part of the degree. So it's a bit of a negative cycle because there's not enough speech therapists to offer placements to train the next generation of speech therapists. And also the funding is to an extent capped by external forces. So there's definitely a shortage. There are around 25% of speech and language therapy vacancies just standing empty at the moment. So there aren't enough kind of roles anyway. I mean, even if they're all full, I don't think we'd be meeting needs. But still a quarter of them are empty, even those jobs that do exist. So and then, you know, whether there's the actual funding need and funding are two different things, of course. So, you know, there's plenty of need for speech therapists, and whether they're always posted in the right places is a whole different thing. So, yeah, it's quite a complex issue. The Royal College of Speech and Language Therapy are doing lots of work trying to lobby the government around workforce planning at the moment, because I think, yeah, it probably doesn't realistically exist. Not in any coordinated way. So yeah, there's a massive shortage of speech therapists, as I'm sure any SENco will tell you.
It's similar to education psychology though, so we have a cap on the number of places for that, and yet we need more education psychologists. So yeah, it just doesn't make sense, does it, to those of us on the ground watching what is happening?
Absolutely, yeah, and it's becoming a less attractive job by the second, because what you can do in that job being so stretched is becoming less and less. So I think people's job satisfaction is going down, which is why, you know, a lot of people are going private now, just to try and give them the sort of working life they actually want.
And you go into schools now, don't you, to go and offer speech and language therapy support and assessment. So can you tell us what a typical day looks like for you? Not that there is a typical day, but what would it look like?
So in schools, schools kind of use me in different ways, really. So I have some schools that use me in a very sort of strategic way, and my job is very much around helping them plan and deliver. So there's a lot of meeting with the SENCos and essentially doing quite systematic things around how, you know, choosing screening tools, managing who does that. A lot of the day to day is actually just trying to make sure people are actually doing the things you've set up. Because staffing is such an issue, it is a fairly repetitive task of going in and seeing if the person you trained last week still exists in that post at all half the time, or if they've been pulled off to do something else. So in that sense, you know, that can be quite a frustrating part of the schools process. But so there are schools where I'm meeting with a SENCO every week, and we're very much going through the SEN register, doing quite strategic stuff. In every school I work in, there's a certain amount of assessment going on at any given time. Most of the schools I work in regularly have some kind of assistant role, and they're often doing a lot of the interventions. And it's my job really to do new assessments and reviewing previous targets to provide that person with the work that, you know, that they're doing, helping them problem solve. So that's probably the, you know, meeting with the SENCO and doing assessments and providing targets is the bigger part of the work. Some schools I'm doing some of the intervention, usually for the more complex children. And then there's the training element as well. There's a lot of just day-to-day problem solving that goes on.
Yeah.
And what I've found in schools, what I've learned to do in schools is go in with a very loose list of things to do, because schools are such, you know, you go in the morning, it's all changed. There is just no point going in with a particular agenda. So I have a list of priorities and they shift constantly. So yes, a lot of that time I'm kind of working by myself with children on, you know, assessments and targets. And basically, the SENCos often just let me go off and, yeah, get on top of the speech and language stuff for them. And I come back and say, oh, I did this, is that okay? And they're brilliant or not. So I would say the way I work in schools depends a lot on the personality of the SENCO as well, and what they need. I very much see myself as a SENCO's ally in helping them get their system set up, helping them keep the show on the road speech and language wise, giving them a heads up about issues that I see cropping up repeatedly, and just, yeah, having the SENCO's back is actually basically what I think my role is, because I know that it can be quite an isolated role for them, as can speech therapy. So I think you really need a team approach, and sometimes I think you're the only person who comes in the week that actually is on the SENCO's wavelength about things.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're right. There is no typical day, but, you know, assessment and intervention are kind of the core activities. But actually, the bit I probably like as much of that is the, you know, problem solving. I'm a very practical person, So when everything's gone wrong since last week, just getting them in there and, you know, trying to get the show back on the road, and finding compromises too. I do find sometimes speech therapists are guilty of being very focused on an individual child, and we want the best for that child, which is very laudable of us, but I don't think we're always aware that the SENCo's also got a million other children. And I personally really enjoy trying to find solutions that are going to help hit as many points as possible across the school.
That's good. You said a couple of times there that you like the problem solving, and there are some common problems that you come across in schools. Can you give us some of those examples and some potential solutions?
Oh, solutions, yes. Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I think one of the major issues is staffing this year in particular has been really terrible. I have come to the conclusion that the best fit to meet your speech and language needs is having somebody to take on a sort of assistant type role. To be honest with you, I've tried to make it work in various other formats. That's not to say that different people can't be delivering, but I have come to the conclusion that somebody needs to be in charge of it, or it's not going to happen. I mean, that's just true in life, isn't it? So, you know, it doesn't have to be a speech therapist. I mean, having a speech therapist in and having an in-house assistant works amazingly well. That is probably the most effective way I work. But just having somebody whose job it is to worry about that and nothing else, with the cardinal rule that they are not to be pulled off to do other things. So I'm actually quite a chilled out person, but if you really want to make me blow a gasket, tell me that the salt assistant's been taken to cover something.
Hey, it happens.
It does happen, and I've put my foot down a lot, because I mean, from my perspective, I see that if you're going to buy in a speech therapist, that's quite an investment, and if you want to use that money effectively, you have to have somebody on the ground. To be doing you know, even if your speech therapist is doing a lot of intervention, that might be once a week. I mean, you just need consistency. That is 98% of what goes on in schools, is getting the consistent interventions running. So the biggest challenge I find is consistency, and that normally comes down to staffing. So unless you are an absolute genius at keeping multiple people going with speech therapy stuff at the same time, then I've come to the conclusion you just need a body whose job that is to worry about it.
Probably. Just getting anybody in a school would be good at the moment, though, to be fair, and keeping hold of them for more than 10 minutes.
And then, I mean, I think the flip side of that is, I think there needs to be a sort of long-term commitment to training staff about the sort of more the communication environmental stuff that's going to contribute to good practice. And what's difficult about that is, I mean, inevitably schools have got so many things to think about. There's a bit of a tendency to buy in something for CPD and just do it once, and like, that's the speech and language box done. And it always makes me laugh when people get me in to do an hour on speech and language, you know, and that's like literally my whole career. And an hour, I could talk to you for an hour about just one tiny little element. And I mean, like all CPD in schools, I think there's a bit of a tendency to do a thing, tick a box, and never think about it again. And I think there does need to be that sort of drip approach to getting CPD messages out there for staff, because the risk of having a speech therapist and maybe like an intervention TA in school is that then everybody thinks, well, that's their job, that's the speech and language source, they don't have to think about it. And you need both sides of the coin. You need the intervention, and you need the good holistic, good classroom practice around. And I find personally, it's my great joy to be in schools every week, because a lot of the best training that goes on is this conversations I have in the corridors, or when somebody's come to me at their wit's end and we just have like 10 minutes in the staff room, because that's the real practical stuff. Like, it's all very theoretical when you're stood on an inset day, isn't it? But you know, and what I love is teachers bring the actual situation to me. I mean, I can talk theoretically, but I'm not a teacher. So when they go, well, okay, yes, but what about this, this, and this? And then you're forced to find a solution that is a best fit. So, yeah, those are solutions. Now, you said, what are the other problems? I thought of one. I mean, access to speech therapists obviously is a massive issue. I've lost my train of thought now. So yeah, I mean, consistency of interventions, and then, oh yes, I know what I was going to say. The other big barrier I find, particularly beyond early years, is the relentless focus on literacy. Can really, I don't know why people think speech and language is not a component of literacy, but it's so, that drive to do so much phonics can really drown out the speech and language component. And I think a lot of children with more specific speech and language issues get missed because they're having literacy issues, and all the focus is about literacy all the time. And actually, it's the speech and language part that was a big component of the literacy difficulties. And I find keeping speech, it's a very natural fit, speech and language in early years. Keeping speech and language on the agenda when, you know, it's not something people are getting measured on, is a really tough task to persuade people to do.
Yeah.
And again, I think it's training, it's being around and having those conversations and showing people that if you want to improve literacy, working on the speech and language is what's going to help you.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But that can be a really hard sell for teachers who are like, yes, but I get measured on this. So yeah, you know, that people relentlessly hearing children read when I know they don't know what, you know, they don't have the vocabulary to understand what they're reading, things like that. That's just a constant.
You'll see, well, we're all seeing an increase in needs in schools and an increase in complex needs, I suppose, in early years and in Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2 even. But even going into secondary schools, we've got students now coming through who, traditionally I always used to teach students who were at P level anyway, so old-fashioned P levels. But they were P8, so kind of working at year one-ish level, which is fine. We could manage that. But we've now got children coming through working much lower than that in secondary. We've got children in Key Stage 2, Key Stage 1, and very definitely in early years who are very, very complex, probably not just speech and language, but other things as well. How can we support them best in school, apart from get a speech and language therapist in? What top tips have you got for us about things that we can do? I imagine the environment's quite important.
Well, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that the thing with more complex children is that you absolutely cannot start with what the curriculum says and try and squish it onto them. It just doesn't work like that. You have to start with a child, or you'll be on a hiding to nothing. And that is also the best route to building your confidence with those children, because I imagine as a teacher, you know, you have to be the person in front of the room who knows the thing, and that is a lot of what your classroom control depends on. And so I think it's a very different mindset to think it's okay to not know what to do here and to look at the child as your guide. It's such a different mindset. Now, it comes very naturally to a therapist because I only have to worry about one child at a time. So I think a lot of it is about kind of just realizing that this child isn't going to fit into the big picture system, and to an extent that's okay. So if you start there, you can just forgive yourself a lot of things. I find teachers have got really high expectations for themselves with complex children, and they've somehow absorbed the message, their job to kind of get them, you know, caught up or off P scales, and maybe they're off P scales, maybe they won't, I don't know. But I go into every complex child thinking, you know, I just put the steps in front of them that I know they need to move on, and I don't worry necessarily about what the destination is or how fast they get there. That's not my job to worry about. And I think in schools you're very much told that, you know, yes, we know exactly where this child's headed. Yeah. And it's just, complex children just don't work like that. So you can almost just like relieve yourself of that responsibility. Because I think that's part of it. What I see people stressing out about is this idea that they need to be in control of it all. You're not in control of it all, so it's fine.
We like that. Can we have that as a sound bite? You're not in control of it all.
You're not. And so it's interesting to me as a complex needs therapist, and I work with families from, like, you know, babies with feeding problems for many years who were going to have very complex needs long term. And when they were very medicalised in special care baby units and things, and there was a sense there that there was a problem and they were fixing it with medication, and then this happened and that happened, and you know, and I would go back after 24 hours and 17 things had happened, you know. And then when they came home, I always used to say to parents, right, welcome, you are on the child's time now. You're not on medical time anymore. And so, and part of that is just not knowing and being okay with it. You know, people say to me, is my child going to talk? Are they going to do this? I'm not, I don't know. Like, and the idea that we ever really know where a child's headed is just this concept that we invented, really, isn't it? Like, nobody can really tell you what the future holds. And so, but I think in schools, they work, teachers are basically told they're responsible for everything all the time, and complex children just need a completely different mindset. So just kind of take that off yourself. You're not the arbiter of all things. So that's the first thing. Also, with complex children, I know this is a laugh because it's hard to get hold of specialists. I would say for teachers, really lean into any specialist you can get your hands on. And see them, I see myself as a real resource for teachers and see us as people there to problem solve. I think it's really common with complex children that they get, stuck with a one-to-one support, and that, a lot of the help and support is going to the TA or whoever, and actually teachers get a bit left out of the loop on that. And, I think have the confidence to say, no, you need to come and talk to me and ask the therapist the questions you actually need answered, because sometimes we are very well meaning, but we don't understand your context. So it's okay if you say, yes, but I'm getting pressure from so-and-so to do this. And again, going back to when I was a complex therapist with really teeny tiny babies, I saw it as part of my role to protect, in that case, the family from all these random expectations from other people. And to an extent, I find that is true of teachers too. Like, if you tell me somebody's giving you a complete unrealistic expectation, I can go and deal with that then, because I'm the person who can do that. I can say, well, so-and-so says that, and I can give you cover.
Yeah.
I can try and give you space. Because I know that you're trying your best and the child's doing fine, but, everybody's got an opinion in schools, don't they? And you're being weighed and measured all the time. So, lean into that, and if you can, and I know, speech therapists and other therapists are very different in how they talk to teachers, but if necessary, just be quite overt with your therapist that I need you to do this for me. Yeah. Because we can do that, and that's how we can be effective in helping you as a teacher or a SENCO. So that's the other thing. And then you're right, environment and relationships are basically where you need to start every time. So it is not, especially with complex children, they are not capable of coming up to where we are. We have to improve the goodness of fit between the environment they're in and where they're at. That's our job. So whether that's reducing the barriers in the way that we communicate with them by being more responsive and less directive, that is a big one with complex children, or whether it's about, looking at our physical environment and the way it's laid out, and just, and all that stuff, looking at the child in front of you, observing them, what helps them, what doesn't help them. It takes a load of time. And people really stress out that, like, there's nothing happening when you're doing that. But there is stuff happening. But from the outside, there's so much pressure on schools to do everything so fast. I can't tell you how often I've gone into a school in, like, it's like week 2 of the autumn term, and everybody's like, oh, bad things happening. Oh, nothing, no, it's terrible. And I'm like, why? What's happened? Nothing. The child hasn't done this yet or that yet. And I'm like, okay. Like, nothing's actually happened except you had a load of expectations that something would happen. And so it's just a completely different time frame. You are on different time now, and you have to give yourself permission to take the time to do that. You are not going to be effective unless you get to know that child, to be honest. And then there's the more specific stuff. Like, I know EHCPs are not always the most useful documents, but do read them. There's stuff in there that's useful, I promise. I know they're wildly out of date a lot of the time, but and then also I don't think people familiarize themselves enough sometimes with the actual things like the engagement model and the pre-key stage 1 expectations and things like that. I quite often go into classrooms, I don't know why, but people feel they need to move off them, or I don't know, I don't quite get the mindset of that, but there's a sense always that we're trying to get people back onto the mainstream curriculum, and it's just okay for children to be where they are, and for you to really familiarise yourself with those standards and ways of measuring and engaging the child, and developing your confidence with that. And if you're going to learn skills, I would put them there and really get confident talking to your SENCO about how on earth do I apply those things in my context, because I still go and see quite complex children sometimes, and they've got some random, like, grammar target that comes from the mainstream part of the curriculum, and I'm like, well, where did that come from? But I don't know, there seems to be this, I don't know if it's implied pressure or actual pressure to sort of get children off where they are And I think educating complex children, you have to see childhood and learning in a completely different way. It's not this linear thing. We're not, education is not only worthwhile if you got them to X points. You just have to accept that that child's human experience is perfectly okay in its own right. And as the engagement model talks about, that kind of sideways progress is just as meaningful as that linear progress that is more traditional. Sorry, I'm just blathering on now. I could talk about complex needs. I answered your question.
I just threw the word complex in to get you going. No, you answered the question, thank you.
A lot of the stuff with complex needs is actually more about people's emotions about the complex needs than it is about the actual content. Because you're often spending a lot of time on whatever target you're working on, you will be spending a lot of time on it. And the things that cause the problems are people thinking that that's wrong in some way, or putting pressure on themselves. Or as a complex needs therapist, I actually genuinely spent most of my time dealing with people's emotional reactions to the situation, not the actual thing itself.
Imagine that, yeah.
So, yeah.
Makes sense. So we've gone from complex needs. What are the most common needs we come across in school then?
What phase of education are we talking about?
Well, if I think back to when I taught in primary school, which is probably 15 years ago now, the most common need, and to be fair, autism was not widely recognised at the time. So communication perhaps wasn't recognised, social communication, that kind of thing. So the only time I ever saw a speech and language therapist was if a child had got a tongue tie, or they had got a speech difficulty, a speech disfluency, or perhaps a stammer. I think now that's probably not much of your role so much. It's something else that you do, isn't it?
Oh, definitely. I would say, in schools, in mainstream schools, I think the actual biggest need, whether it's recognised as the biggest need or not, is actually understanding language, to be honest, because, and I think it's probably massively under-recognised. So those children who are verbal, they're superficially talking, they're often your children with behavioural issues, they're not very attentive, their memory isn't great, they're not very organised. And at the root of all that somewhere is, I actually don't understand what you're saying to me.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably the most common thing. Now, I don't think if you ask somebody from the outside that question, I don't think they'd say that. But yeah, I think, so receptive language is a technical term for that. I think receptive language issues go massively under-recognised. And particularly like once you're out of key stage 1, I think those often people perceive the issues to be literacy. But when you dig around in that, there's working memory issues and speech and language go hand in hand. So yeah, working memory and speech and language are the things that are actually underpinning literacy, but everybody focuses on literacy. So yeah, I think receptive language is actually probably the biggest need. There is a massive increase in social communication need in autism, though, for sure. And I don't know, that's a little bit about we're just better at recognising it for what it is. I also think people have higher expectations than they used to, that actually, this is not a bad thing at all. People expect to be mentally well at school now in the way that you would just, like when I was a kid, everybody was just, well, get on with it, basically. Nobody sat around worrying about our mental health a great deal, I don't think. As we move away from that sort of compliance focus kind of, well, just sit there and produce the work, I think people have got higher expectations, and so the more subtle kind of forms of social communication need are being recognised now. So that is definitely, and in terms of EHCPs, that's the biggest communication need. Speech and language doesn't get much of a look in on the EHCP front as a sort of lone problem. It tends to get wrapped up with other stuff. So yeah, but yeah, language, I think language problems generally are much under sort of diagnosed. I think in early years they're really obvious because you tend not to be talking if you've got a language need at that point, and that's fairly obvious. But once children have sort of are talking on the superficial level, people think, oh well, the language is fine. It's amazing how often I'll take a child who I was having a lovely chat with and I thought was nothing up with this child. If I do a detailed assessment, they've got gaps here. And they're just, a lot of these are bright children who've got great coping strategies.
Absolutely.
Mm.
And you've made the link there between speech and language and literacy skills, but there's also quite a strong link between speech and language, which is perhaps not identified, and behaviour. So SEMH type stuff. And I imagine that comes from those communication skills that are perhaps a little bit weaker, and the language skills not being able to I suppose, express what they want to say, so it's easier to shove somebody out of the way, but also that receptive language, understanding the rules of what they're supposed to be doing. Is that common? Is that something you're seeing?
Yes. So when it's interesting, if you look at the stats for primary need on the SEN register and EHCPs going into primary versus secondary, SLCN is reasonably high up on the list, and SEMH is pretty low down on the list at primary, and then they kind of swap places. Yeah. And I think, well, the children didn't actually like transmogrify, do you know what I mean? It's just that's the overt presentation has changed. Yeah. Definitely. There was some stat this week, I don't know if you follow the NAPLIC account on Twitter. You're going to ask me what NAPLIC stands for, and I can't remember, but they're the national organisation that basically puts together conferences and things, and there's a special interest group around developmental language disorder.
Okay.
And they had a conference for specialist teachers this week, and there was some stat. They'd done a piece of research around basically talking to teenagers with DLD, and there was some amazingly high percentage of them said, "Oh yeah, I did a behaviour because I didn't know what was going on." You know, that's what they reported. I didn't know what was going on, so I walked out of the room or threw a chair or. Yeah, so I would always, I mean, for me, if you see a literacy problem, think language. If you see a behaviour problem, think language. It's not that every language and behaviour and literacy problem is a language problem, but I think it gets missed, especially as children get older.
I think you could do with ruling it out before exploring perhaps other, quote, labels for it.
Yes.
That would definitely be useful. In fact, you mentioned the secondary dip, because I'd actually scribbled that down on my bit of paper there. We do see a massive dip from primary to secondary. And although in defence, so the latter half of my career I worked in secondary, we would have a lot of students come through who would receive speech and language therapy in reception year 1, perhaps, nothing through year 2 to year 6, and had still stayed on the SEN register with SLCN next to their name, come to us in secondary, and you kind of look at it and you just think, well, okay, they've not received anything additional to or different from, don't really know why you're there, going to take you off. Next thing you see, as you say, SEMH, but we don't necessarily pick it up as speech and language in secondary because of that reason. But then again, also, the primary school wasn't really doing anything for 5 years.
Yeah. Yeah, completely. I know that's a really common pattern. In fact, last year, one of the secondaries I work in, we did a big piece of work of going through their register and deciding who needed specialist assessment, who needed more of a screening approach, because that was exactly, is it possible that all these children have SLCN? Maybe they do. Yeah. But like you say, they haven't had anything. And I think a lot of services get concentrated in the, early years and Key Stage 1. And that's partly, I'll be honest, because the easiest to identify at that stage, and the interventions you can offer are quite generic. Yeah. When they get to Key Stage 2 and beyond, the reason there's not more out there for Key Stage 2 and beyond is because it's really hard to do generic things for those children and be effective, because their speech and language skills, the range of needs they're having, their profile of need, how it presents, their coping strategies, they're all kind of one big ball of string at that point. And so it's so much harder to put a generic intervention in. And so we kind of do the easy bit, don't we? And then we go, oh, well, I mean, you're talking now, you used a verb, brilliant. You're probably good enough. And we sort of stop looking for trouble, to be honest. And I don't know about anybody else's area, but here the NHS don't offer a secondary service at all.
Well, ours would if you referred within the first 6 weeks of them attending secondary school, but actually first 6 weeks is settling period. You don't tend to see any difficulties.
Absolutely. I mean, they're still trying to find their way to classrooms at that point. So
yeah, that one. You don't see anything. So yeah, it was difficult.
And I think there is a perception that things can't be done at secondary level for speech and language. I don't think, for some reason, I think a lot of speech therapists don't like working in that environment. And there's a bit of a fear factor. There's a bit of a lack of research. So, it's harder to feel confident with your evidence based on your backpack, because you are flying a little bit without without a safety net a bit more at secondary, because you have to pull together, you can't go out and buy a nice resource in quite the same way that will tick all your boxes. There are things out there, but you do have to work quite a lot harder to meet their needs at secondary. So I think it becomes a little bit, people perceive there not to be a need at secondary because the services don't exist. And, I don't think we're doing children great service, really, to be honest.
So I'm going to ask this one. I never know whether it's elective mutism or selective mutism or situational mutism, because I'm sure somebody changes it every other week for me. So I'm just going to say mutism. Yeah. I've had 2 students in the past who have been mute. One of whom came to my class and from the very first day spoke to me, and I didn't actually know until the end of the second week when his mum came in and said, "Is he okay? Is he sad?" "Yeah, he's absolutely fine. He's been joining class discussion this afternoon." She went, "He doesn't talk." "Yeah, he does." So he was fine. The other one, I did the whole lot. I did the sliding in technique. I did the blowing the feathers. We've had the musical instruments and making the noise. She was a stubborn one. Couldn't get anything from her. Does mutism fall under your category?
Under speech and language therapy?
Yeah.
Well, yes, I would say so. It is a bit of a tricky one because it is a communication need, but it's essentially an anxiety-based difficulty. So it does fall between 2 stools a little bit. So some speech therapy departments will say that's their bag. Some areas won't touch it because they don't feel the anxiety treatment is our skill set. I tend to take quite a pragmatic view that somebody should work on it. So they're my revenue. But you often find it bouncing around between CAMS and speech therapy.
Yep.
I find, to be honest, much depends locally on whether somebody's got an interest.
Okay.
I think that, so yes, technically, yes, it does fall within our remit. But I think because it's a relatively small part of the caseload and it's relatively specialist and it's a quite different skill set to a lot of other therapy skills, you can imagine of all the specialist areas in the speech therapy, and we're all fighting for our little bit of CPD and training, that it probably gets a bit left out. I do think something that's working in its favour, I think there's more of a recognition that it's not uncommon for children experiencing selective mutism to be neurodiverse in some way. I think there's more of a recognition now of that. And so I think that will bring more attention on selective mutism as part of a kind of wider understanding of how those children communicate. So it's, to be honest, it's a little bit of a neglected area in speech therapy, I would say. But speech therapists definitely do treat it, I promise.
And like I say, nobody seems to know what the title is this week.
I think technically the diagnostic label is still selective mutism. Yeah. But you do hear people, I don't love that term because it's not really true, is it? It's not, to the child, it doesn't feel like a choice to them. So they don't experience that as something they are selecting. So I think situational mutism is actually what people who tend to work in it will often call it. But like diagnostic, in terms of the actual labelling, that's still what it's called, selective mutism. Yeah.
We'll go with that. Now I'm going to ask you a controversial question.
Okay.
Take a deep breath. PECs.
Oh, yes. Okay.
So a bit of a debate at the moment as to, I said it was controversial, bit of a debate at the moment. So we know that we use it as an alternative form of communication for some students who are struggling to communicate in other ways, but it has its links to ABA and those kind of forceful behaviour techniques, if you like, from the autism world. What's your take on PECs?
Okay, so I'm just going to tell people what PECs is because people call a lot of things
PECs. Please do.
So PEC stands for Picture Exchange Communication System. So it's literally a very specific way of using pictures to exchange with another person to communicate a message, and it's taught in an extremely specific way. So a lot of people call anything to do with pictures PECs. So visual timetables are not PECs. Other symbol-based communication systems are not PECs. PECs is just the one where you hand over the thing. So just to kind of clarify for people. I mean, I personally, I can only speak personally on this one. I have in my career worked in environments that were very, where PECs was very embedded with quite complex autistic youngsters. I find that doing PECs well is really, really hard. I find there's not enough training around, and understanding how it's supposed to be implemented, actually getting that done in practice is really hard. I really personally don't like it when therapists use it as a first line thing, especially in schools, because, for example, to teach the principle of an exchange in PECs needs two people. How many schools do you know that have two people just sat around waiting to practice an exchange? And so I personally, one of my issues with PECs is that I think in the real world, I don't think we are usually equipped with the skills and time and resources to actually do it properly. So that's one thing. As you said, PECs has got its roots in ABA, so applied behavioural analysis. And what autistic people tell us is that techniques that are focused on essentially a behavioural outcome, i.e., you communicate when I want you to, or whatever, they tell us that those things are harmful to them. So, and I think I personally wouldn't be much of a speech therapist if I didn't listen to people when they were telling me things, and that's what they're telling me. So, as a rule, I think when I first qualified, there weren't that many good alternatives to PECs, and so that's what we did. But personally, the number of times I've seen it really well done is quite small. And I have seen a lot of children become very prompt dependent because it's been done poorly, essentially waiting for verbal prompts. Now, that is not how PECs is supposed to be done at all. I'm talking about badly applied PECs here. But the number of times I've seen really well done PECs versus badly applied PECs is really tiny. So badly done PECs is not great at all. You end up with young people who will exchange because you told them to, essentially, which is not really communicative at all. So there's that. I think famously it can have some issues moving on beyond requesting for things. And though they do address that, I will say that, but I've always found that having worked very hard on trying some later stages of PECs, I think it can be a hard thing to pull off. So there's a lot of practical issues with PECs. I don't love the roots in ABA. Having said that, I would never say never to PECs because, what I do think it is sometimes good for is when children are genuinely not understanding that they need to do something to make things happen. Sometimes a physical exchange of something concrete can be great for teaching that skill. I personally try to move on from that method into much more language-rich methods like communication boards, other forms of AAC, as quickly as I can. So the other thing with PECs sometimes is that it's not actually that language rich. You teach I want and then a load of nouns, and children can't take that anywhere. They can just request now. And so I think what's come later in the way of other alternative communication methods are much more open in terms of the language you're offering children, the expectations. You're basically saying, I'm putting this language in front of you because I believe you can use it. So that idea of presuming their competence in accessing language. And it's easier to promote other types of communication with other AAC systems, commenting, making jokes, basically sharing communication for the sake of it. And then lastly about PECs, personally, I think one of the issues with PECs, and actually any form of AAC to an extent, is that we don't spend enough time promoting the quality of the relationships and finding motivating things to do together before we plough into the actual method of communication. So when we are thinking about communication, we need what we call the means of communication. That might be PECs or a communication board or signing or whatever. But we need so that's the means. We also need reasons to communicate and opportunities to communicate. And I think what all of us tend to do is plough on and go, oh, I like the idea of that communication method. And we forget to spend the time building this lovely basis of we enjoy being together. We've got reasons to communicate with each other. I'm a big fan of intensive interaction, which is essentially a slightly more formal way of doing child-led, person-led interactions to teach foundational communication skills. And I think there's a lot of pressure, particularly when services are stretched, to kind of get them started on a system. Actually, haven't spent the time exploring what motivates them, what are their sensory preferences? How are we going to, so sometimes what you do, you end up with a child who uses PECs or whatever really well, technically, but they've got nothing they want to talk about.
Yeah.
So we need to be, PECs, yeah, I don't love it. I wouldn't, it wouldn't be my first choice.
And I'm very much the same. So, yeah, for me, any intervention or any way of doing anything, it will work for some students. It doesn't mean it has to work for all students. And this is one where potentially it's the last resort measure, perhaps, that other things haven't worked. Let's see if this one's.
Yeah, I agree. I would usually try other things. Also, my general philosophy is to use the least intrusive intervention I can.
Yeah.
And it is quite an intrusive thing. You have to do a lot of physical prompting.
Yeah.
And so I would always start with approaches that are much more rooted in typical, development of interactions, really, if I can. And I'd have to have a really good reason to go down the PECs route. So I know there are therapists who are like, no PECs, no way, never. But I mean, I don't think I can ever really say that. But I would say if you're going to use PECs, you badly need to be well trained doing it.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And try finding that training. Good luck, because it's like hen's teeth. It's practically impossible to find it.
Yeah. You see, I do still follow PECs on social media. They do advertise training from time to time, but of course it's the funding, and you really do need. I don't think it annoys me when speech therapists set up PECs and then don't go back often enough to support the people implementing it, because if you're not going to implement it well, you might as well not bother, to be honest with you. You're just going to get the appearance of communication, but not actual communication.
Absolutely, definitely. So you mentioned when you were talking there, and I'll make this the last question, then we'll let you escape because it's getting warm and stuffy. So technology. Assuming we've built relationships, assuming all of that is there, we've still got children who are struggling with speech, language and communication, so we're going to use some technology to support them. What kind of technology is out there and available?
Okay, so there are various forms of AAC, which stands for alternative and augmentative communication. So children, essentially that's things that either replace spoken language or supplement it. I think people go very quickly to the tech place for that. So there's what we call medium tech options. So that would be things like a Big Mac, things that you can record messages on, for example, or a sequence of messages where there'd be like a button with messages on. That would be kind of medium tech. High tech, there's loads of high tech options out there now, would be more what speech therapists call VOCAs, so voice output communication aids, are very popular. There are lots of different softwares for doing that. So the thing you need to know about high tech is there are two elements to it. There's the access method. So that's how children physically access the machine. That might be direct on a tablet. It might be something like eye gaze, because you can't physically access a device. It might be something like, so for some of the young people I work with, they would use something called auditory scanning, where somebody would read the options out in a sequence and they'd have some way of saying, yes, that one. So that's the access method. And then you've got the actual software itself and what that can do and how it's designed. So those are decisions that need to be made. Ideally, if you're going down that route, you'd have access to, there are specialist AAC hubs all across the country that you should be able to tap into, that have specialist technology people, specialist speech therapists, specialist OTs. Ideally, you can look at the criteria for those that you'll have in your area. In the Midlands, it's called ACT, but they've got different names. But a few years ago, they had a big redesign, and so every area does have these specialist assessment hubs. Because the thing about high tech is people like the idea of it, and they buy something, but there's actually quite a lot to think through about high tech and getting it implemented. And so those people are specialists in helping you. And also, then there's new software and stuff coming up all the time. It's almost impossible to keep track of. So somebody like me would refer to them and say, right, can you help us sift through all these different options? And then there's the actual just physicality of the device. How portable is it? It's all sorts of stuff about high tech. So people love high tech, but they often don't realize how complicated it is. Having said that, if you're just looking for something high tech and you don't have any support at all, which I know is true for some people, there are loads of free apps that can get you started, to be honest with you. So there's one off the top of my head. There's one, I go blank when people ask me things like this. Cough Drop is a good one to get started with. Some of the actual bought versions have like light versions that you can try. So things like, let me think, I think there's a Proloquo version, like a
There is
free
a free
version.
version of Proloquo.
I'm trying to think now. And then I think there's a certain amount you can do. Smartbox have got something called the Grid, which has lots of language packages in it. And there's something called the Grid Player that gives you access to a certain amount. So it's often worth looking for the free kind of starter versions of things. So there's loads of apps out there for communication. What a speech therapist would help you do in that situation is help you think through all these factors that are going to make it a good long-term choice for you, ideally. Having said all that, I think people rush to high tech too quickly, and there is a lot of use in low tech. I'm just trying to think if I've got something low tech that would be handy. No, that would be too easy. So low tech, by low tech, I mean basically paper-based systems that involve usually pointing, not necessarily, but with various amounts of language on a page. You might just have one board, you might have a whole book, and people are often a bit dazzled by the tech, I find, and they think that's going to solve a problem, but you need to have worked through your issues and really understand what you're trying to achieve with it. Often with low tech first is a good idea. I'm not saying you necessarily have to use a load of low tech before you go to high tech, but actually it'll help you think through, well, what language do we need in this? How accessible does it need to be? So yeah, people will often get dazzled by the tech, particularly like when eye gaze came out, it was like revolutionary. And then everybody was asking for eye gaze because it's really funky, right? It's like super cool. It is really, really cool. I mean, it's absolutely amazing, but it's not for everyone.
No.
It's not, it's not the most efficient system for everybody. Sometimes people get fatigued using it. And so in an ideal universe, you would access a specialist team because people just think, oh, I'll just buy that. They all look the same to me. But it's like all these things. Like if you know what you're looking at, there's a lot of differences. And what a specialist team will do will try and plan in the longevity of what you're doing. And there's often a lot of work to implement and get everybody using that device. There's often needs to be a high commitment around the team around to modelling that device consistently. And so, are you still going to be quite as excited about the device when you have modelled the word want on it a million times that term? The child hasn't used it yet. So there's a lot to think about with high tech.
Absolutely. I think also my experience of using tech with different needs and different difficulties is it tends to be a bit limiting in that, for example, Twinkle actually have an AAC version, but the words that are on there, we only have, let's say, dog and cat. We don't have the different types of cat. We don't have the different types of dog. And for a child who has perhaps wants to express those different things, it makes it very difficult for them. It limits their vocabulary even further and limits their communication to what is available within that technology. Whereas something else would, potentially work far better.
Right, that's completely true. And because people get a bit focused on the access method, and they're not thinking about, there are loads of, even if you get a piece of software like the Grid, for example, there are loads of different language setups within that. And you need to be thinking about, where is this child heading? What are aspirations for them? What do they need? And you're completely right. Sometimes we are accidentally limiting children's choices because essentially we're making decisions about what language they need.
Yeah, absolutely. We're choosing the words that we want them to use, or the words that are going to be available to them. And I think the other problem with the tech is usually because it's the school that ends up buying it, they see it as a school item. Whereas actually a lot of these things need to be school and home and social environment and everything else. That was certainly my experience at the time. And that means the child doesn't feel confident with it when they're in school. So therefore they don't use it, and that they feel a bit too different. Whereas if you're using it at home around family and friends, it becomes second nature.
No, completely. Yeah. And that's why you need, so for example, if you go through a specialist hub and meet their criteria, and there are things they don't fund, but that device is funded to the child, not to the school, if you go through that method, and which is great because if you're not all going to take ownership, it's not going to work. I mean, can you imagine having this amazingly rich access to language in one environment only?
I know, it doesn't make sense, does it? It really doesn't.
No. There's a lot of work to be done building people's confidence with the tech. giving people ownership of updating the vocab, and there's a lot of work to do with AAC. And so, yeah, absolutely, you need to give consideration to just like what's the level of commitment of everybody, who's doing what. It's just super practical things. I mean, like anything in schools, it's the practicalities that will get you, because we all had a big enthusiastic conversation, but nobody decided who was going to, I don't know, do the photocopying or. And so that's the basics of AAC falls down on who's putting the charger in overnight, stuff like that that falls on.
I'm not going to comment on that, knowing how many times my iPads were not charged. And then, of course, we've got the technology that supports speech and language. So a kind of our intervention type technology, I suppose. So I can remember I used to use Splingo. I don't know if you remember Splingo, which is an app on the iPad. Yeah, I come across like this. So it's a speech and language intervention. I have no idea what the GO stands for, but it had got things like prepositional language, so in and on and under, and it was quite good fun. But I used to use it with EAL students as well as my speech and language students, just to help develop that vocabulary. But it's got about 7 different areas now of speech and language. I quite like that one. I just thought I'd throw that one in. And if anybody,
sorry, did I take that high-tech conversation in a completely different direction?
Oh, no, not at all. You took it exactly where I needed it to go, because we were talking about eye gaze before we started.
People often ask me about apps, and to be honest, I'm just not particularly. It's not my real go-to thing. This is just a habit of my therapy. It's not my go-to thing to use an app as a, in more of a provider
human relationship.
Because yeah, to be honest, it's not that I'm a tech phobe. I think they're great, but I think our children are a bit starved of human interactions, to be honest with you. And so, and unless I really have a good reason to use an app, I will usually try and do it kind of, the old slow human way. But I do use apps, definitely. And sometimes they're the only thing you can use to motivate. But again, they come out so fast and they change so quickly. People ask me, and I might do research, and 6 months later, that one doesn't work anymore, and it's not available. And also, different people often do them. So you can get quite a lot of that stuff for free, but because somebody's developed it, but then it won't work on this device, and it's a little bit fraught with difficulty. But I do find more speech therapists are bringing out that kind of thing now.
They are, I use the Call Scotland website. We'll put a link underneath the video of this, and they've got some really good wheels with the different programs on there, which if you need AAC, we'd recommend looking there. If you need apps to support language or speech and language. I suppose the reason we resort to them, though, goes back to the very first part of our conversation. We haven't got any staff. So we can't have human communication, so we're trying to plug the gap elsewhere. Unfortunately.
Yes, and it is unfortunate. I mean, I don't. The thought that we can teach children to humanly interact without human interactions is just madness to me. But that seems to be what we're trying to achieve. And then we wonder why they've got social skills are poor. Yes, I mean there are means to an end, and like some people just, I don't know, some people are just techier people than me, and that's their natural fit. There are therapists who use apps all the time, so I've not got a particular problem with them. It's just not my personal style. Not least because, I mean, yourself in schools, I might have an app on my phone, but can I connect to the Wi-Fi, and can I get a data signal, and will a firewall let me do things? I mean, it's just a complete nightmare. So I'll stick with paper, and I spend a lot of time drawing, to be honest.
You see, I can't draw, so there's no chance of me doing that one.
I mean, either. It becomes a focal point that how bad my drawings are.
Brilliant. And Harrod, I thought that was a fantastic session. You've answered all the questions I could think of, and the couple that had come up on the Excel sheet earlier. So thank you so much for that. I hope you had fun talking to me.
Oh man, I can talk about speech and language all day. I love that. Normally people are like, yeah, all right. And I normally get shut down when I get on a full flow about speech and language. People are like, yeah, I've got this to be. So that's great. No, I love talking about this stuff.
I think it's given everybody some ideas of, perhaps some low-tech, high-tech things that they can do. So that idea about relationships, that we definitely need our teachers on board. And maybe when we have another session in a couple of months' time, we can talk about some strategies that teachers could embed in just general classroom teaching that would support all students. I think that would be really a useful way of heading forwards, because we've got the increasing numbers and now we need to do something about it.
Absolutely. But there is always something you can do. Don't feel helpless is what I think, because sometimes, I mean, myself, sometimes I think, wow, like the need is so overwhelming. I feel like I can't do a thing.
Yeah.
But there is always something you can do. So yeah, we can talk.
Absolutely. And we will see you all soon.
Thanks for your time, everyone.
Oh.